I work as a supervisor in a rundown warehouse district on the outskirts of town. It's as dull as it sounds. My job is simple. Check the warehouses, make sure everything's in order, lock up at the end of my shift. That's it. Nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that was the case, until Warehouse 13 reopened. Warehouse 13 had been abandoned for years. According to some of the old-timers, it used to store outdated, broken-down equipment, things nobody wanted or needed anymore. But one day, for reasons no one explained, it was sealed up tight, and nobody went near it. Recently, however, with the company needing extra storage space, it was cleaned out and put back in use. I was assigned to monitor it like the others. Routine, right? But from the moment I stepped inside Warehouse 13, I felt off. The door itself looked like it might fall apart if you stared at it too hard, and the inside, pitch black, dank, the air thick with mold and rot. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak, spasmodic light over the darkened space. Nothing to worry about, I told myself. At least that's what I thought, until the weird stuff started happening. One night, as I was finishing my rounds, I heard something. A metallic screech, sharp and grating, like steel grinding against steel. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came from deep inside the warehouse. My first instinct was to blame the wind. Only, the windows were all sealed shut. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside to investigate. The darkness swallowed me whole, the rows of rickety wooden shelves looming like skeletal sentinels. Everything was covered in layers of dust, so thick it was clear no one had touched anything here in years. Yet, as I ventured deeper into the warehouse, the scraping noise stopped. The air grew heavier, colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was about to turn back when I spotted something. A door. A small, rusted metal door tucked behind a stack of crates. I had walked this place 100 times, but I could have sworn I'd never seen that door before. It didn't belong there. It was old, the hinges corroded, and it had no lock. My pulse quickened as I debated whether to open it. Something about it drew me in. Something wrong. I grabbed the handle, gave it a pull, and the door groaned open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into the earth. A gust of freezing air rushed up to meet me, sending chills straight down my spine. There shouldn't have been a basement here. None of the blueprints showed one, but here it was, like a secret buried beneath Warehouse 13. I switched on my flashlight and started down the stairs, fighting back the dread pooling in my gut. Steps stretched longer than they should have, lit winding deep underground, far beyond what seemed possible. My sense of time warped. Minutes felt like hours as I descended, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. After what seemed like an eternity, I reached another door. No markings, no signs, just cold steel. I took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was vast, empty. My flashlight's beams swept across the barren concrete floor, finding nothing. But at the center of the room was a metal table. On it, a notebook, old and crumbling, edges of the pages yellowed with age. I approached it cautiously, flipping it open. The handwritten notes inside were scrawled in thick, erratic strokes. Each page described gruesome experiments in chilling detail. My skin crawled as I read. August 5, subject to 47. Result, unsuccessful. Subject expired 72 hours after injection of Compound X. September 17, subjectum 53. Severe neurological damage. Subject exhibited extreme aggression. Immediate isolation required. October 30, all data transferred. Laboratory closed indefinitely. No further access permitted. I stopped cold when I heard it. The faintest of sounds from the far end of the room. A low, tortured moan like someone struggling to cry out, but too weak to do so. My heart pounded in my chest, and a slick wave of cold sweat ran down my back. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and my stomach twisted. Huddled in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was someone, or something. Figure was contorted, skin sagging and charred in places, patches of hair clinging to its scalp. Its eyes, bulging and wild, caught the light. It was human, or had been. I stumbled backward, the horror of it all sinking in. The thing in the corner dragged itself toward me, its voice a raspy whisper, words too garbled to make out. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, breath ragged, heart hammering against my ribs. The echo of my footsteps rang out in the narrow stairwell as I raced back to the surface. I didn't stop until I slammed the door behind me and locked it. A The whole time, I expected someone, to grab me from behind. That night, sleep was impossible. All I could think about was the notebook, the experiments, the deformed man, or whatever he was, down there in the dark. How could something like that exist, hidden beneath the warehouse? How had no one known? The next morning, I went to report it to the higher-ups, but when I returned to Warehouse 13, I found the door to the stairwell was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. No sign of disturbance, no hidden panel, just a blank wall where it had stood. For a long time I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth gnawed at me. Whatever had been hidden beneath Warehouse 13 was real, and some things, once uncovered, don't want to stay buried. It was a dreary, rainy night when I finished my shift at the diner. I worked late nights, and on nights like this, I often felt an inexplicable surge of energy. Maybe it was the constant caffeine and adrenaline, or maybe it was just the quiet of the empty streets that left me feeling restless. Either way, I knew I'd need a melatonin to get any sleep once I got home. I drove my usual route, a winding road that was scenic during the day, but became a pitch-black tunnel of nothingness at night. The road was dotted with the occasional parking lot of small family-owned stores and restaurants, but mostly it was just stretches of dense forest and shadows, the kind of road you wouldn't want to be stranded on. As I passed one of these forlorn parking lots, I saw a figure under a lone streetlight, waving her arm frantically. My headlights illuminated a woman in her mid-50s, tall and thin, drenched by the pouring rain. She was drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. My first thought was, not another hitchhiker, but there was something about her that made me hesitate. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Do you need a ride?" I called out over the roar of the rain. The woman approached, a look of relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank you. You're a hero," she shouted, her voice strained and thin. Her smile was wide, but there was something unsettling about it, an odd, almost desperate edge to it. I noticed she was missing a few teeth, her mouth a gap-toothed grin that made my skin crawl. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Just up the road to town," she replied, her voice cracking with each word. She climbed into the car, and I could feel the seats becoming damp. I told myself I was just doing a good deed, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Her wet clothes had an overpowering odor, masked somewhat by the rain, and her hair, normally scraggly, was now slick and straight. I pulled into a gas station at the intersection, deciding to fill up. I offered to get her anything from inside, but she declined. "No, thank you, dear," she said. I left her in the car and went inside to pay and grab a few drinks. When I returned, the woman was gone. I scanned the tiny parking lot, but she had vanished without a trace. I felt a twinge of guilt and concern, but also a strange sense of relief. I filled up my tank and headed home. My apartment is on the ground floor of a two-family house. The front door is usually left unlocked, with the two apartment doors locked separately. I entered out of the rain and made my way inside. I set the drinks on the counter and took a melatonin, hoping it would ease me into sleep. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind. Around midnight, I woke up in my dark bedroom. This was unusual. Melatonin usually knocked me out cold. I reached for my water, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure crouched in the corner of my room, hidden behind the dresser. My heart leaped into my throat. Was I dreaming? Slapped my face, trying to wake myself up. The figure stood up and walked toward the door. I was paralyzed, unable to make a sound. When it left, the silence was deafening. No footsteps, no creaks from the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad, my hands shaking. "Dad, you have to help me. There's someone in my room." He sounded groggy. "Trish, it's probably just a night terror. You know how these things can be." I stayed on the phone with him, pacing around the apartment, turning on lights. The living room was empty. I checked every corner, but I found no sign of anyone. Rational part of me wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I locked my bedroom door and tried to sleep, though sleep was elusive. In the morning, I awoke to find the door to the foyer unlocked. My heart sank. I rechecked the apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. My gym blanket was missing from the back of my car. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. That woman must have slipped into my car while I was inside the gas station. Somehow, she had managed to get into my apartment. Panic set in. Called my dad again, my voice trembling. "Dad, my blanket is gone. I think she got into the car. What do I do?" "Check to see if anything else is missing. If not, calling the police might not do much. They'll just take a report," he advised, trying to calm me. I searched the apartment, but nothing else was missing. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I decided to skip the gym and lock myself inside, hoping I'd feel safer. But the unease never left me. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. A month later, I found a new place. The old apartment had become a dark reminder of that terrifying night. Every little noise made me jump. I couldn't help but think of that woman, the stranger in the rain. When I was a kid, my family moved into an old house on Winter Street. It was built in 1923, and despite its outwardly charming appearance with its quaint brick facade and ivy-covered walls, it was the sort of place that made me feel uneasy from the moment I set foot inside. I grew up in a family of skeptics. We weren't particularly religious, nor did we believe in the supernatural. But what happened in that house defied all rational explanation. The house had an unsettling atmosphere that seemed to cling to every corner. My sister and I shared a room upstairs. It was a large, dusty space with creaky wooden floors and an old-fashioned accordion door that never quite reached the floor. The first incident that made me question my sanity occurred shortly after we moved in. One evening, as I sat on my bed reading a book, I heard the floorboards creak outside our door. It was a sound you'd expect from someone walking down the hallway. I glanced up just in time to see a white, misty figure pass by the crack at the bottom of the door. My heart raced, and I waited for the familiar sight of my mother's feet to appear, but they never did. I crept to the door and looked through the gap. Nothing. The hallway was empty. There was no breeze, no open windows, just an eerie silence. I was left feeling unsettled, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Later that week, I was alone in the room when the lamp on the wardrobe began to sway violently. The base rattled and the light flickered erratically. I was terrified and ran downstairs, only to be met with puzzled looks from my family. They dismissed my fear, but I noticed a strange look in their eyes, as if they were hiding something. Another incident occurred during a summer afternoon when the electricity was cut off. My father had turned off the breaker while working on the garage, and there was no power in the house. My sister and I were sitting in the living room when the window air conditioner suddenly roared to life. We stared at each other in disbelief and rushed outside to tell our parents. My father was baffled, insisting it was impossible since the electricity was shut off. We had no explanation, only an overwhelming sense of dread. Things continued to escalate. One day, I left a fan on in my room while I went downstairs to shower. When I returned, the fan was off. My mother and sister, who had been home the entire time, denied touching it. I felt a creeping sense of paranoia. Why would the fan turn off on its own? Feeling of being watched grew stronger. We had an old cassette recorder, and I once left it running while I went to play outside. When I played back the tape, it sounded like a man and a woman were arguing. Their voices were faint and distorted, but I knew I was alone in the room at the time. At night, I would see strange flickering lights in the dark, like tiny sparks floating in the air. I now recognize them as what people call orbs, but then they frightened me deeply. I would rush to my mother's room, only to be reassured it was just my eyes playing tricks. I was too young to understand, but my nights were filled with an inexplicable terror. One recurring nightmare involved a little girl in a white nightgown, crying in the hallway because the house was on fire. I would wake up in a panic, checking every electrical outlet to ensure everything was safe. The fear of fire became a constant companion. It wasn't until I worked at the local library that I learned about the house's history. Before it was built, a hotel had stood on that land. It burned down in the late 1800s, killing many people. This revelation sent chills down my spine. It seemed that the land itself carried a dark history. My father, who had been the most skeptical of us all, began to question his own beliefs when he started hearing about our experiences. My brother, who worked late nights, often came home to hear someone calling his name. He thought it was our mother, only to find her asleep in her room. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and he began staying over at friends' houses. One night, my sister woke up to find a figure sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. He thought it was me, but when she turned and saw I was asleep, the figure vanished. To this day, she sleeps with her head under the covers, her arms tucked tightly. My mother had the most terrifying experiences. She once felt a hand on her chest when she nearly fell down the basement stairs. The touch was gentle, but it stopped her from falling. Another time, while vacuuming my brother's room, she heard the vacuum turn on and start moving across the floor by itself. She ran upstairs to find everything as she had left it, with no one else in the house. The phone would ring incessantly, with no one on the other end or only static. Occasionally a voice would say, "I saw Barnabas leave for work." Police were involved but couldn't trace the calls. After we moved, the calls stopped. My mother was worried the spirits might follow us. One morning, she found an old Bible on her nightstand with the words highlighted, "This house will be my home forevermore." Thankfully, the spirits didn't follow us. Living in that house had a profound effect on me. I became more sensitive to the supernatural, though I try to stay rational. The experiences in that house left me with a deep understanding that there are things beyond our comprehension. Moving out was a relief, and I'm grateful for the experience because it taught me that there is more to life and death than we can understand.